What's up? Welcome to our flagship episode of Dragon Storm's Ancient Myths, Legends, and Lore. Kind of a mouthful to say. I've had a YouTube show for a couple of years, and I met Anthony, actually an attorney by trade, also an author of a really cool book series, and we got to talking about it's kind of how can we promote the book series, but then we started talking about all these cool things, myths, ancient legends, and lore, and I'm into that type of thing, and so is he. So we said, this would be a great idea to start a YouTube channel, a show about there's hundreds and hundreds of legends and myths and ancient lore and all these things that all over the world that people have interest in. If you're like us, we're interested. I myself am an author, novelist. I write books about a mafia family, and I spent 13 years in prison, believe it or not. That's where I wrote my books. I wrote 9 novels while I was in prison. I got a pretty crazy story. Documentaries being made on it now. It's just I have an interesting life. So you wouldn't think that someone like me would be all into this kind of this genre of legends and lore and mythology and all this stuff, but I am. So I'm super nerdy like that. And so is Anthony. He's really into this stuff and wrote some truly amazing books that are doing really well. And I just thought this would be a fun concept to do a show about. And every week we'll do a episode or show where we address one specific ancient myth or whatever. And on today's episode, our flagship episode, I thought I'd make it pretty easy for people to relate because everybody knows about Egypt and some of the more famous legends and lore there, King Tut and all that. Tutankhamun is his real name. And I said, let's talk about that because I think a lot of people have an interest in it, but they don't know that much about it. But so anyway, Anthony, you are the expert. I am just the kind of spastic nerd who's into this type of thing, but you're the expert, you're the smart guy. And so what do you think about all this, Anthony?
I think it's a great way to introduce people to a little bit more depth behind some of the things, like you said, that a lot of it is common knowledge about the curse of King Tut, or the Sphinx, and all kinds of different theories about it, especially with social media and things. These days, everyone has a conspiracy myth out there. So I thought we would talk about some of the real factual stuff.
Yeah.
When I do my writing, I take a lot of that and I put a supernatural spin on it, which is very easy because a lot of this stuff is of a mythical nature.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that, like you said, we could come together and really present this from the two viewpoints of, from the little bit more of the scholarly side of things to what the common man might be looking for to learn from it. And I think it's going to be an excellent way of approaching these things.
I think it's an excellent way of I don't want to say anybody's like uneducated, but most of us, like you said, the common man has some knowledge of these things, but I think it's the common man also is super fascinated about it and definitely interested in learning more about them. So on today's show, we're going to talk about King Tut and the Sphinx and stuff, but I would like to talk about King Tut. Well, start with King Tut, and his real name is Tutankhamun. And why is King Tut the most famous of all the pharaohs of Egypt?
Well, King Tut is kind of an anomaly from an archaeology standpoint. He is so famous because we found an intact tomb, and most tombs in ancient Egypt have been raided, and most of their belongings the treasures had been stolen. But he was one of the first and only where we found a completely intact sealed tomb. So it was probably, if anyone could imagine this, on the very, very low spectrum of what a pharaoh's tomb would have looked like. And that's because he was a very young pharaoh for a very short period of time. He really didn't do much of anything. And because of that, it really was just thrown together. There was from his body structure, they see he had some malformities. He was a sick boy, and he only ruled for a very short period of time. They threw his funerary tomb together. They probably expected him to have another 50 or 60 years of life. And so what you see with that tomb really is at the low end of what the splendor would have been from a great pharaoh like Ramses the Great or something like that. But that, unfortunately, was all raided and stolen. But it was the first real tomb with all that treasure in it. It spread like wildfire across the entire world. If you look back at news articles and things from the 20s, it was all the rage. Egyptology, Egyptomania, they used to call it. And people really became fascinated and alerted to what was going on over in Egypt thousands of years ago from that discovery. So it's kind of like an entry point into the world's fascination with Egypt.
And what did they find? Like, what did they find in his? Now, he was his sarcophagus. I can't pronounce that. Was it in one of the pyramids or?
No, basically it's in the what's called the Valley of the Kings. Now, the pyramid is a funny thing, and we'll talk about it at another point, I'm sure. No one was ever buried in the pyramid, and the pyramid had rooms that they call funerary chambers, but there was no one ever actually buried in the pyramid. The Valley of the Kings, the way that the ancient Egyptians, the Nile runs through ancient Egypt, and along the Nile is fertile land because of the water, and everything else is desert. So the ancient Egyptians had to deal with a very isolated area that they could have crops and things like that, and be supplied with water. On the east side of the lake of the river is where live Egyptians lived, and on the west side of the river is where the dead were buried. So they were called Westerners. But the Valley of the King is on the west side of the Nile, and it is a massive excavated area where they would dig into the earth and they would hollow out the ground, and they create these long chambers and catacombs, and that's where they would bury their kings. And people have to realize the Egyptian civilization, the organized Egyptian civilization, was around for thousands of years. If we take that in perspective of, let's say, America, we're looking at 200 or 300 years. In America, they're talking about 3,500 years of pharaohs and life over there. So as you can imagine, there's still so much that hasn't been found, but that the entire Valley of the Kings is littered with a burial ground for the kings. And the way they found King Tut's tomb was actually they had been excavating another tomb and throwing the debris from that excavation on, and actually buried King Tut's tomb again. And Howard Carter, whose name is pretty commonly known now too, he thought that to dig where they had thrown all the rubble from another pharaoh's tomb, and that's where they came. So if you can imagine, into the ground and coming upon, they're removing all this dirt and rubble and sand, and they come upon a stone sealed chamber door, and then they know they've found another tomb. And there were steps. I think there were 3 or 4 steps leading down into the earth that led them to that door, and that's how they knew where it was.
What did they
So,
find in there as far as like valuables? What did they find in King Tut's?
Yeah, the Egyptians were an amazing people. They believed in the afterlife, and they believed that when the dead passed away, that they would need everything that they would need in their normal life in the afterlife. So besides the jewels and the treasures and all those things, you found things like a chariot, a bed,
bowls and silverware,
bowls and all that stuff like that. And even they believed in so much that life carried on in the afterlife that they created these little servant statues, which are called Ushabte statues. And I can show you, I have a couple here. So these are these Ushabte statues. So what they would do is they would make one of these for every day of the year. Okay. And they put them in a little box with all these little, they were supposed to represent the person who had passed away. And what they would do is each day when they were called to come work in the fields by, the greater gods, they would call upon their servant statue of that day, and he would go out and work in their stead. So they had this really, really rich belief in the afterlife, and a lot of the things we see buried in the tombs, and actually a lot of the stuff that gets left behind in the ones that were raided as well, is just daily things. Like I said, chariots, weapons, bowls, anything that they would use in their daily life, they buried with the pharaohs.
No, that's not normal for everyday Egyptians. That's just for pharaohs, right?
Correct. As an Egyptian became wealthier, they took on more steps towards what the pharaohs ultimately had.
Yeah.
So they would create these funerary texts, which were great long hieroglyphic inscriptions that were supposed to guide them in the afterlife, was supposed to protect them in the afterlife. So the more money people, they actually spent their entire life investing, as they more wealthier Egyptians spent their entire lives investing in creating their afterlife.
Their burial tomb.
Yeah. So like you said, the the man who wasn't wealthy, or the family that wasn't wealthy, they had the very limited burial rights, and that would be just buried in the sand. They would dig into the sand there because it's such an arid location. There was no real high degree of decomposition, and they would just bury them in places out in the sand. And as of course, as you became more and more wealthy and became more and more powerful, those members of society, they got the bigger, the better, and eventually you get to the pharaoh who buried their entire daily life with them in their tombs.
And their tombs were big, like that. Depending on your wealth or stature, you'd have a small tomb, or you could have this massive tomb like the pharaoh would have. Yeah, I always see that's a misconception. I always thought that the pyramids were in fact like burial tombs for the pharaohs. That's what I thought.
The pyramids are an enigma in and of themselves because we really don't know so many things about them. I mean,
yeah,
and we don't know how really they were built. We don't know the exact time period when they were built. We have a good idea on the pyramids, but maybe not the Sphinx. But and what their true purpose was, we don't really know. They are astrologically aligned with Orion's belt, and there are a lot of mathematical equations like pi that come into play that are exact. It is such a high degree of mathematics that are interlaced into the building of there's three great pyramids there. We know of the big one that everyone sees. There's actually a cluster of three in a row, and they go down in size. Their mathematical computations for things, like I said, like pi or the astrological association of them, is so precise and so in depth that today we need to use.
We couldn't do it.
We need computers to replicate their mathematics. Yeah.
That's tricky. So one of the most fascinating things I think about all of this, and in Egypt, the tombs, the whole thing, is that we don't really know what happened to the Egyptian society and culture. Like, first of all, why don't we know? Why didn't they write down? I believe they are one of the first people to create like paper or hieroglyphs, right? But not just hieroglyphs, but like papyrus and stuff. So why didn't they kind of write down what is happening in their culture and why it declined, how it ended up vanishing, and also these miraculous, almost supernatural ability to create these massive pyramids? I mean, for us to create something like that now, we need computers, modern equipment, excavators. I mean, and it would take a decade, and there would be like they cut those stones to such precision and in such a location, like you said, lined up astrologically, that I mean they're perfect. So when the light hits just right, it shines on this chamber. And could you imagine building something that massive? And if it's just 1 inch out of place, then it won't work for its purpose. I mean,
that's right.
So what happened? And how come we don't know what happened?
I think a lot of what ended up happening as the society went on was we had a lot of rising powers in other parts of the world that invaded. So, we have the Greeks and the Romans who just, they laid waste to most of the world that they could get to. So, we have Cleopatra, which was she's famous during, she was a Greek and she was famous during the Greek rule. She wasn't an Egyptian. And we have Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great conquered Egypt too. And founded the city Alexandria, which is a very famous Egyptian city now. And then in the same sense, we also had the Romans who invaded. And a lot of it had to do with the pharaoh at the time and whether they had droughts, because droughts were a serious problem. If you have this massive army that can protect the borders of Egypt, but you don't have enough food to feed them, you become susceptible to raiders. So, as society evolved and the armies became more mobile, so now you didn't have local nomadic tribes in Egypt trying to seize power there, which went on for 1,000 years or whatever. You have these massive armies that march across the continent and take over, lands as they go. And that's was just a natural progression of man. We as we evolved in our military prowess, we were able to, travel across the continents and take over everything as they went. So that was a big part of Egypt's decline. Another big part of Egypt's decline was a decline in their religious beliefs. They went back and forth a few times over the thousands of years between a multi-god system of multi-theism where they worshipped Ra and Isis and Osiris and all these names that most people have heard. And then they got a pharaoh by the name of Akhenaten, which a lot of people are probably familiar with too. And Akhenaten decided that Ra, the sun god, was the only god. So he actually converted them into monotheism. The problem with that is a big part of their caste system in Egypt was the religious basis, was the priests and the temples, and that kept order. It created a monetary system through the temple system.
Yeah, the donations and whatnot.
Right. So when he took that power away from the priest, which is essentially what he did, he kind of destroyed that portion of it. Now, when King Tut, which comes right back around again to King Tut, who was probably Akhenaten's son, came into power, he decided, because he was young and he was influenced by the priests and the people around him, that no, we're going to return back to the monotheistic. I'm sorry, to the multi-god system.
Yeah.
And he reinstated all the priests and he redid all this stuff. And then he was probably murdered shortly after that. It's a funny how that turns with Tut and Akhenaten. But that being said, that back and forth, the breakdown in the religious beliefs, the introduction of Roman beliefs, the Roman gods, the introduction of the Greek beliefs and the Greek gods. So what you have is this melting pot now of a society that was a very pure and very isolated and controlled society. Now you have all these other cultures coming in, and through cultural diffusion, which I remember because I just did it with my kids. I remember the words. You have all these other societies and religions get melded together with theirs, and that's where we really begin to see the breakdown. Towards the beginning of modern times. And it just gradually continued through the centuries, where, like you said, we lost all this knowledge. And that leads us into a lot of the things where we have these, I don't want to call them conspiracy, I want to call them alternative theories, where, there was a supernatural intervention, or there was technology that was given by an alien, society or something like that. And these things are not so outrageous to think about anymore. Because there must have been some intervention or some type of of technology at some point, right? There must have been.
Right. My whole thing is this: either there, I kind of believe either there was some kind of ancient intervention, alien intervention, and I'm not saying that there aren't. Like, there's anomalies in humanity, like Stephen Hawking's or something. There's very exceptionally intelligent people who can see and read mathematics on a level that the rest of the world can't. So it's possible he was the guy. There was one of them there, and he said, "Hey, if we do this, we can do that. It'll make the gods happy." And Pharaoh was like, "All right, I'll dedicate what's the modern day equivalent of $10 billion to build these temples or whatever." But on the other hand, I'm not saying we don't know what happened 5,000 years ago. Where did some alien life form come here? Because we'll get into and out of the shows, we'll get into some of the Mayan ruins and things like that and legends behind the Mayans. But ultimately, 2,000 years later or whatever it was, the Mayans on the other side of the planet decided to build structures that are not as big but similar and for this with the same precision and stuff. Like, how does that happen? I mean, what is your theory on that?
Well, that's a very interesting idea, and it's something that I do like to think about often, because a lot of the research that I do for my writing and just that I enjoy just doing in general, there's a lot of tie-ins, and by that I mean there are a lot of really isolated and separated societies from ancient time and cultures that have very similar things. Now, one argument is it's the natural evolution of man's thought processes, of technological advances. So therefore, that's why we're seeing these commonalities.
I don't know.
The fact of the matter is, you have depictions and legends,
hieroglyphs, images.
All about different gods by different names, but they represent the same thing. And then you have the same architectural and construction techniques that are so different for the time that it would be hard pressed to say that someone in China, Mexico, and Egypt at the exact same time in history, there were three different individuals, at least three different individuals, who came up with the same ideas for construction, astrological alignment, placement on the planet. All these things would have to come together from three societies that had no communication at all with each
Yeah,
other.
zero.
Right. And that to me is something that it doesn't make any common sense at all. I don't believe in coincidences, and therefore I don't know what the tie together factor is, but there is some tie together factor there, which has to exist. It has to. It's
Yeah.
too much of a coincidence otherwise.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and this is what leads me to believe there was some kind of ancient aliens, or it's weird when you say aliens, but I mean, we'll get it. We'll do whole shows on aliens and those like conspiracies or theories, like you said, alternative theories. I'm a firm believer in aliens. I believe mathematically, if you look at the sky and you think, well, there's in our galaxy alone, there's 800 billion stars. I mean, and mathematically, if you do the math, what are the odds of planets landing at the right proximity, like Earth did from a star their whole life? It's somewhere between 1 million and 25 million. It could be a lot more, but at least between 1 million and 25 million planets in our galaxy alone should sustain life. Now, here's the thing: what if those planets, the life began to evolve 1 billion years before us? Because we're new. The humanity's very new. Humanity's brand new in terms of like the history of the universe and stuff. So we're let's even call us a couple million years old, but really real humans are modern humanities, evolution, technology, societies, 15,000 years, maybe 20,000, whatever it is.
Yeah, at the most. Yeah.
Yeah, if you look out at the star and you go, there's a star out there, and the life began to evolve on the planet around that star 500 million years before us. What could it create? What resources are there? Like what kind of, like, we kind of know what elements and resources we have here. It's not like we're discovering new things all the time, but we do. The periodic table today has got 100 more elements on it than it did when I was a kid. So we're always finding new elements and stuff like that. But what elements are on those planets? Like, I love like the scientists who like to think the whole universe is made up of this small group of elements, and they know it's all. So every planet, every star, everything, they're like, it's all made up the same stuff. So it's not. How the frick do you know? Like, what makes you think? Are you that arrogant to think that there's freaking trillions of galaxies out there? And because you got a Hubble telescope that can kind of look at some gases on the other side of the galaxy, you think you know what's out there? I
Yeah,
mean,
they're full on air, right?
right. And they're so arrogant to believe that they know it's all. There could be elements on planets or stars or whatever and other galaxies, or just within our own galaxies, that have like something the size of this has enough energy, the fuel of space travel ship across the universe or something. We don't know. We're babies. You know what we are in terms of organic life forms in the universe? We're like ants. We're really not very involved. We're not very evolved. And so how, when you look at some of these things like Egypt and the Mayans and like other places, how did they do it? At the time, we were so unadvanced technologically that just don't believe that they could have done it without help. That's my opinion. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I just was reading an interesting article and I actually saw on the Ancient Aliens, which I love to watch too. And I think we've spoken about it before. Some of the things I attribute to supernatural that they might attribute to alien.
That's true.
But I like all the theories anyway. But there's these areas where the cut in the rocks cannot be reproduced by our most advanced cutting system
Right.
and lasers today. We cannot reproduce them.
Right.
And if to say that someone did these by hand, again, it doesn't seem to make any sense. There's no common
It's
sense behind
implausible.
it. It's implausible. But with the tools that were available,
Right.
and like you said, the we are lacking so much knowledge about time and space. Civilizations could be, unfathomable the amount of
Yeah.
time they've existed before us.
Right.
And we think of things like you said, power to travel in a ship or things like that. Their mode of communicating with us or getting to us or anything like that may be something that we can't even fathom how they do
Exactly.
it.
It's
Our
beyond
thoughts
imagination.
are so constrained to what we know.
Right.
So, to try to solve or really analyze some of these ideas becomes hindered by our lack of our
Yeah.
ignorance of the
Or becomes hindered by our own arrogance to think that we know. And again, I mean, it sounds crazy to say this. If you look at, I was just flying over New York City a couple of days ago, looking down at the city, and I'm like, geez, they built that big, massive city. Humans did, and there's all that money down there. But I'm thinking we are such a new organism in the universe. I mean, we're just really brand new. So it's to think that we have all the answers is insane because, like I said, and in all reality, we've only made like real technological advances in the last, let's call it, since the Industrial Revolution. I mean,
Sure.
honestly, since the late 1800s, to be honest with you, is when we've actually started to grasp technology, and then of course, if you look in the last like 50 to 75 years with computers and modern airplanes and things like that. That's it. 50 or 75 years. What I'm saying is, what if we had another 500 years or 5,000 or 50,000 or 500,000? How about 50 million? What if we could advance for another 50 million years? What could we do? Look what we've done in just 50 years technologically. Now imagine, and like 50 years ago, if you would have said, well, you can look at across the galaxy with the Hubble telescope, all of the computers, you have a smartphone, you can touch screen smartphone and stuff. If you started telling people that 50 years ago, they laugh at you. You think you're out of your freaking mind. You're not going to be able to talk to people around the world. There's things called social networks and blah blah blah. It's just you're crazy, right? So the people today who don't believe in aliens, I believe they're the crazy ones. And I also think the scientists who think they have all the answers are also the crazy ones, because like you said, I remember reading about those perfect cuts in the Mayan temples and
Mhm.
Egyptian ones too, which they just couldn't be replicated with modern technology. We're talking lasers, laser precision, and like diamond, wheel cutting
Yep.
machinery. Couldn't do it, and then put them in the place in the exact same spot, A to Z. I mean, if you hired, it would cost you, even if you took $100 billion to try to replicate the. I don't think they could do it. So I have to believe there was some divine intervention in the world of some kind.
Sure. Well,
But
that's what, if you go back to to a lot of the Hebrew legends, and not to get off track from Egypt, but I mean we're in the same area, is King Solomon. King Solomon's legend is probably not as well known by everyone, but it involved his ability to control what was called at the time demons. So he was given a ring by God, which gave him control, King Solomon's ring, and he was able to call upon demons to construct the Temple of Solomon, which was this tremendous undertaking as well. So if we take that idea and that legend and we say, well, the people at the time were using the words and the ideas that they understood to explain what had happened. So, were they calling these demons? Were they really an alien life form, not a demon as they personified them then? And was this ring? Was it some form of communication device that allowed him to speak to someone who was, or something
right,
that was not in our
yeah,
universe, that allowed him to instruct them what he wanted them to do and stuff like that. So sometimes if we take those legends and those myths from ancient time and we take away the concepts or the ideas that people of that time had to explain things, it opens up a whole new doorway into what actually may have happened.
yeah.
Um, the demons and the ring from God may have been just their simplified way of explaining,
Communication device.
communication and construction being done by some alien life form,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know,
exactly.
or a supernatural life form. If that's where your thoughts go, was
I
it
think,
angels or things like that?
or God, right? So I'm a Christian and I believe in God, and a lot of people, like my wife, believe it or not, doesn't believe that in aliens, because she believes God would let us know in the Bible and da da da. I'm like, but there are instances in the Bible where the Bible refers to like these giants that came down to help the Jews and all these things. So I
Sure.
mean, I think that the supernatural element is very possible. I'm a firm believer in it. Like God separated the Red Sea. There's even the whole thing with the Egyptians and the Jews with the locusts and the 7 plagues and all that. There's a lot of supernatural stuff happening in Egypt. Why? Like maybe this was all part of God's plan to raise up and advance the Egyptians to the point to where they could enslave the Jews. And I don't know. I don't like. I don't speak for God because I try not to do that. This is a good theory, but whatever the case is, there was a lot of things happening in Egypt back then, and that led into that. What that bled into the Jews, the Greeks, like you said, the Romans, and then all of a sudden, almost it seemed very abrupt that the Egyptian society and culture kind of came to an end and kind of just, I don't say vanished, but all of a sudden the society was gone. At what time in history did that happen? About 2,000 years ago?
Yeah, it basically we had a major break from the great pharaohs of Egypt when the Greeks and the Romans started to take over and
And what
rule.
happened to the people? They just kind of dispersed into Egypt and they left
I think
everything.
I think what happened is you had like I was saying, that melding of the different
Mhm.
races together. So you had the Greeks and the Romans marrying and producing offspring with the Egyptians. And that went on for hundreds of years, and there was a slow decline they no longer had the military power and the military might that really kept them in power for all those years.
Mhm.
And you had the opening up of the world to all these other societies that were now coming in. And then that coupled along, you had the colonialism. So as we moved through the centuries, the English ended up
Taking over.
taking over Egypt, like they did with most of that area. So
And
that
all those tombs got raided by tomb raiders, and billions and billions of dollars in precious gems and jewels ended up. They're still out there. I'm sure they're still.
they're still out there. There's a theory that there's 100 times what's in the museums around the world. There's 100 times that in people's private collections,
Yeah,
that probably we'll never get to see,
yeah.
unfortunately.
Or they just melted it down and sold it for cash. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? Some tomb raider, whatever. Well, it's been fascinating, man. I could talk about this stuff all day. Next
All
week
day.
on next week's show, we're going to talk about the Sphinx, which is a really fascinating subject in Egypt. We're just gonna start off with a little Egypt stuff, but we're going to get into other stuff. And anybody who watches this, if you have an ancient myth, legend, or something like that you want to know about, drop it in the comments, and we'll look into it. We'll do some research, and then we'll talk about it. I mean, that's the fun part of the show like this. We're trying to educate and have some fun. In the meantime, everybody, I want to make sure you check out Anthony's book. I was going to call him Tony. Tony's book, Dragonstorm. He's got a 2-book series out. The second book just dropped, but make sure you check out the first book. That's more important because it's book 1 of a series. So you need to know the characters. It's really cool. It's an interactive book. So there's references to websites and stuff like that in the book, and you click on the website and go there, and there's like clues and information you get for the book. And it's really interesting story, very powerful, dark story where this evil is trying to take over the world, but this little cast of characters are trying to stop it. And this guy, his name is Dragonstorm, right? The
Alexander.
Alexander, I'm sorry, Alexander Storm is the one who's trying to stop this evil from taking over the world, and it'd be the end of humanity. So these guys, like cast of really smart people, it's their mission to stop this. So, and they're on it. But so everybody, stay tuned for another episode next week. We'll do another one. We're gonna do the Sphinx. We'll do some other stuff, but everything from every kind of crazy ancient legend you can think of, and we're gonna do a lot of them that you probably never heard of. But
Yes.
when you're done hearing them from us, look them up, look into them, research them. Super fascinating stuff.